You've heard about this idea, right? Neuroplasticity, that the brain changes to the demands that we place on it, with great names. You know, you might recognise some of these: Norman Deutsch, Barbara Arrowsmith Young, Mark Treadwell, as I said earlier. And the idea basically is that the brain will change not only to physical practice, but to mental practice as well. Okay? Using our imagination to be able to make physiological changes in the way that brain works. And we do it all the time, and just in daily life. I know for me, I've learned to not only improve my academic performance, but things like learning a language, second language, Māori, and learning to juggle, right? Things like this. We see it in, we see it in sports, education, all kinds of areas. I know my niece, for example, was involved in a really bad car accident 2 years ago. She was basically in a coma, diagnosed with DAI, which means diffuse axonal injury. Her brain had been shaken up so much the axons, or the brain cells, had pulled away the neurons, and she made a complete recovery. They thought she was going to die. But in 2 years now, she's going to Sydney to start a new course in singing. Incredible nature and the way that our brain changes. I've even changed my accent. Are there any Australians in the room? Do I sound different to you?
To what?
Does my accent sound different to you?
From other New Zealand.
No, just from what you said. Yeah, that's a joke. Don't worry. So we're changing all the time, right? We're changing our brain, incredibly changing. And this is how it works. As we're receiving information through our senses, okay, we have neurons, brain cells, neurons which are like little tree branches sprouting out, forming connections. Okay, we know that sort of stuff. But the thing that's quite interesting is that there's only like 7% of our brain cells are made up of neurons. And that the new research that's coming out now is related to this idea of these astrocytes. Okay? Now they're star-shaped and they only work chemically, and they kind of hang around the neurons, and after a while they kind of take over from them. And I'll explain this a bit more later, and the implications this has to learning. It's all about getting these astrocytes involved. Right? So the new suggestion is that we've got this, what's called a tripartite synapse, which is basically saying it's not just about the neurons forming these neural networks and connections to the knowledge that we're learning, but these astrocytes play a big role in that, and they influence these neurons in the way that we learn. Okay? The other I think useful information to know about is the way that our brain waves work. The activity, the amplitude and the frequency of neural activity influences our attention, our learning, memory, creativity, and we can manipulate those brain waves deliberately in the classroom. Okay, so kids are more switched on. All right, so the research around that I'm going to pass over to you in a little bit. So just as a way of giving you an illustration of this, you've seen these kind of things before, right? As far as brain cells, neurons, information coming through our senses. So right now you're seeing things, hearing things, okay? My voice and so on. And your brain starts to form these new connections based on maybe former knowledge. You might already have neurons or a whole, millions of neurons established, synapses, connections formed around this bit of information about neuroplasticity. And maybe I'm sharing something that might be new, it might not be, that starts to build on that. So we get these connections. It fires off as you're hearing and seeing things. Your brain fires off little electrical impulse, calcium ions that go down what's called an axon, and it jumps across a chemical exchange here to fire off the next one, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So a piece of information in your head, like, I don't know, when you were 9 and you learned your times tables, what's 5 times 5? Come on, 5 times 5. What? Yes. Okay. Now you should have been able to free flow that, okay? Because as far as the brain is concerned, we have these other type of brain cells that if you get repeated neural activity and the same chemistry occurs, these astrocytes, they only work chemically, okay? They hang around in a synapse, and if it's kind of like they're keeping watch of what's happening. And if you're continually repeating information, you're going over it, you're reflecting on it, the same neural activity is occurring to that bit of information that you're trying to learn, then these guys take over. And after a while, you can just free flow your understanding. You just know that 5 times 5 is 25 because you rehearsed your times tables over and over and over and over and over again. Okay, and our memory is improved as we go through this as well. And the main thing is, however, is that repetition is just one principle of getting these astrocytes involved. Okay?
So does an astrocyte actually develop like a neuron develops?
Yes.
And then it stays there once it's been
Yes.
chemically switched on.
There's masses of them. They work in domains, and they might reach across the brain to like 2 million synapses. Okay, one domain might influence something like 2 million of these little things. And we know that they influence what's actually happening in the chemical thing. But the main thing I think is useful to notice that after a while, we don't really have to consciously think about stuff anymore. The learning that we have, we can just free flow it, right? So I would say, think of your astrocytes as your free flow brain cells, okay? And we're trying to get, as far as rapid learning goes, kids to get these astrocytes kind of picking up the information so that the neurons can start, because there's 7% of them, right, can start focusing on the next thing, learning task that I have to pay attention to, and the next one, and it's free flowing. And memory, as I said, memory is associated to these astrocytes as well, semantic memory. So, chemically mapping, yep.
Is this analogous to long-term memory then, what we call long-term memory? We don't really have to think about it.
That's right, non-conscious thinking, which is long-term memory, stored in your brain and in areas all over your brain. And Mark will go into much more detail about this as far as where he thinks memory is stored, which relates to dendrites and the aspects of dendrites. But I'm not going to go into that right now because I don't want to get into too much. I just want to pull out some of these little ideas in relation to the practical implications for us as teachers, right? So the astrocytes chemically map repeated neural sequencing, which enables then sensory input to pass to a non-conscious way. And we do this all the time. You know how you drive to work, right? And you've done it so many times. The routines that we have, you're not paying it, you don't have to pay attention anymore to all the cars going past and all the things, right? You just free flow it. And you're actually thinking about something else while you're driving, multitasking. Because you've done it so often, you know how to drive, it's passed over to this free flow, long-term memory, right? In a free flow kind of way. And now you've got this kind of secondary attention happening. Does that make sense? So what? Well, what it does when we're working like this is that we can predict sense perception, okay, without having to be consciously aware of it. We kind of know what's coming up as we're driving to work, or we're pulling up, right? We kind of know because we've done it so many times. We don't have to consciously think about it. We can predict. So all of our routines, all of our habits, the way we run our life is basically non-conscious, right? And some of the research, the little funny things about, Kerry was talking about Einstein this morning. One of the things with Einstein is when they dissected his brain, one of the differences was that he had masses of these astrocytes around the neural connections, more than they'd ever seen before, because he had focused on so much. Now his thinking is more non-conscious. And you know that idea of the absent-minded professor who forgets about their glasses or where they put stuff, and we do it, right? Because the prediction matches the experience. See, you know what's going to come up, and it matches it, so you don't even consciously think about where do I leave my keys, so on. The habits, the routines, the things, the way we live our life tends to be more non-conscious. But learning requires a conscious attention, okay? And as I said earlier, to get these astrocytes kind of working, they can help us, but they can actually also hold us back in some ways because our attention might not be focused on the right thing as you're trying to teach. Okay? Because the routines are there, the classroom might be all the same, kids coming in, classroom's all the same, you're dressed the same, you're doing the same stuff, and they're just running a routine and not actually paying attention anymore, getting neurons activated. Okay? They're just free-flowing the routine of learning. Yeah. So, I'll give you an example of this. What do you see there? Read it out. What does it say? Cat sit on a mat. Did you notice this? Yeah. Skipped over it? Yeah. Pretty easy to do, right? Because it's so common. You've got all this form of knowledge. You've got all these neurons formed about words of these simple words and a picture of a cat. You know what a cat is. All of that's stored in your brain. And so you just kind of, well, it's very easy. Not all of us, but we just flick over it and we miss some details here. Now, there's a problem sometimes when we miss details, and I'll explain this later. You see, you know how we've seen these before, right? How you can you've got enough information, stored in your memory, okay, to make sense of this somehow. Form a knowledge, and you start reading through it, and after a while, you can predict what the words mean, just maybe the shape of some of those letters or numbers. You see how it works? So it's a way that our brain works to predict sense perception, so we don't have to be consciously aware of it anymore. Okay? Astrocytes. Now I'm going to pick this up again in a moment, but another thing that's quite helpful, I mentioned at the beginning, was about these brain waves. And again, Mark will talk about this more tomorrow if you're planning to go to his session. That as we're receiving information, neurons are firing, and all of these different types of neural networks are created according to the experience that we're having, and that we can measure the electrical and chemical exchange and the electricity in the brain. And you know, normal waking state tends to be more kind of beta, a little bit of gamma, which is so many cycles per second, hertz, right? So you might all be, as listening to me now, all in gamma, but as you get more relaxed and maybe you find it's really boring, you might start to find yourself drifting off, which goes into more, and then down to here, sort of delta sleep, okay? But what we know, and some of the research around this idea of deliberately putting our brain into kind of an alpha, sort of theta, slowing the brain waves down to sort of it's 7 to 12 cycles per second, but that basically means the brain becomes more receptive to information that we're trying to get in there. Interestingly, the Earth, planet Earth, is that frequency, okay? So when we go into nature and we're walking on the beach, you know how we kind of start to relax and harmonise? Because our brain waves harmonise with the surrounding environment, okay? Surrounding environment. If we're working in a big office block with lots of fluoro lights and lots of activity, as far as electronics go, it's a very high gamma, beta sort of frequency. And if our brain tends to harmonise with that, then we start to get a bit itchy, a bit anxious a little bit. So that kind of, what I'm saying is that the learning environment impacts these brain waves, and we can deliberately manipulate these brain waves to help improve learning. One of the ways we do that is with music. I'll give you an example. So if you were playing music in class or in your own learning, as now, there's music out there which creates a binaural beat, tries to harmonise the two hemispheres of the brain, which kind of gets us down into a relaxed alertness of this sort of alpha area. This guy here, Robert Desmone, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, is doing work with children right now to use music to modify or alter their brainwaves to see how that influences their attention, memory, learning, and so on. Okay, so there's research being done on it right now. All right. So, just turn it down. Just come back. Hold on. Come back. So the idea is, with creative thinking, is we can actually generate creative thinking as far as what everyone in these presentations are saying. Students need to be learned to be more independent in their thinking and more innovative and so on. That if they can start to take the concepts that they're building and use them in different contexts, there's a way to do that. And as far as how the brain works, and Julia Aitken did it with us in the creativity session last week, where you take two totally different ideas. Someone was asked to think of a problem and walk up to a random person who was asked to think of a single word. Yeah? And the problem and the single word came together. Well, what that means as far as the brain goes is that a whole bunch of neurons that are firing off related to this problem are firing in this area of the brain, and then someone brings in another idea, totally unrelated, right? Fires off a whole bunch of other neurons in the brain. It might not even be connected, physiologically connected, but suddenly something new comes out of it, a new idea, concept, and a conceptual framework, if you like, where two different concepts come together to form a whole new idea. And that's what invention and innovation is all about. Yeah? So as far as the brain research goes, we can see how we can deliberately improve creativity in the way that we think with our brainwaves, okay? Manipulating brainwaves.